저 드레스는 내 드레스야! 아니야! 어떻게 네가 이럴 수 있어?
The ballroom was impeccable. Chandeliers glittered like jewels hanging from the ceiling. Soft-hued flowers filled every corner, and guests, cell phones in hand and carefully positioned smiles, awaited the moment everyone believed would be a celebration. The groom, standing at the altar, exuded confidence. The bride, stunning in her white gown, walked with slow steps, carrying her bouquet as if she were carrying the future. Everything seemed too perfect to be real, and indeed, it wasn't. Amidst the smiles and suppressed applause, an unexpected presence interrupted the fabricated fairy tale. A woman emerged from among the guests, determined, her eyes fixed on the bride, as if recognizing something no one else dared notice. The dress, the lace, the cut, the details. It was impossible not to recognize. That piece wasn't just any dress. It wasn't new, and certainly not chosen by chance. It was the same dress she had designed, sewn, and worn years ago at her own wedding to that very man. The scandal was instantaneous. Eyes widened like arrows. The groom paled, the bride froze, and the betrayed woman made a point of revealing, in front of everyone, the origin of the dress she wore with such pride. The silence that followed was not one of respect, but of sheer embarrassment. And there, amidst expensive flowers and false promises, there remained only one question that no one dared to say out loud. Why would someone choose to marry using the very symbol of the woman who was? Discarded? If this twist caught you by surprise, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to follow the next stories that no one expects, but everyone needs to see. Long before the glare of the spotlight and the rehearsed applause of Seoul's elite, there existed a seemingly simple love story forged far from the red carpets and society columns. Ji-yeon, the daughter of a traditional family that valued honor over ostentation, met Kang Min-ho when he was still a young, rising executive, struggling to make his mark in the competitive corporate world. At that time, Min-ho didn't carry the arrogance in his eyes that would later characterize him. On the contrary, there was a flame of ambition mixed with insecurity, and Ji-yeon was the first to believe in his potential. She supported him in everything. While Min-ho spent entire nights poring over reports, trying to find a strategy to impress investors, Ji-yeon would brew hot tea to keep him awake and silently review documents, as if she were part of the same dream. On freezing winter mornings, when he hurried off to crucial meetings, she was the one who straightened his tie and whispered words of encouragement, words that remained etched in his memory like a kind of invisible amulet. In the eyes of many, she was not only the ideal wife, but the foundation that supported the edifice of the future Min-ho intended to build. Over time, the two came to be seen as an admirable couple. Korean society, always attentive to appearances, saw in them the perfect combination of tradition and modernity. Min-ho gained ground among the top businessmen, and Ji-yeon, though discreet, earned respect for her elegant posture and the serene smile she always wore. Some said she represented the calm needed to balance the storm of his ambition. However, behind closed doors, the marriage began to show almost invisible cracks. Min-ho, increasingly consumed by his lust for power, became cold, calculating, and distant. Dinner. Conversations were replaced by silence. Walks hand in hand through the streets of Gangnam gave way to increasingly frequent absences. Ji-yeon, even sensing the change, chose to believe it was all simply a consequence of the weight of responsibility that fell on his shoulders. She continued to fulfill her role silently, as she always had. She prepared the house for important guests, attended social events with a practiced smile, and pretended not to notice when Min-ho looked away in public. Her heart, however, began to fill with questions she didn't have the courage to ask. How long would the love that had sustained so many dreams withstand the indifference that now grew between them? And it was precisely in this gap between her devotion and his coldness that a new element began to emerge. A discreet presence, almost imperceptible at first, but which would soon become the spark that ignited a devastating fire. Because while Ji-yeon believed she was just dealing with the emotional distance of an overwhelmed husband, in reality, something much deeper was already being plotted behind her back. It was during a rainy afternoon in Seoul that Yoon Hye-jin, newly hired as a secretary in Min-ho's department, first appeared before the company's watchful eyes. Young, elegant, and with a surprising ability to navigate corporate corridors, she knew exactly how to attract attention without seeming obvious. At first, no one suspected her intentions. She was just another efficient professional who stood out for her quick problem-solving and the strategic smile she offered at just the right moments. To Ji-yeon, Hye-jin was just another employee, someone who served as her husband's advisor amidst his exhausting schedule. She even greeted her politely on a few occasions, unaware that behind that respectful gaze lay a silent ambition. Hye-jin studied the CEO's every gesture, noted every detail of his preferences, and turned them into invisible weapons of conquest. Over time, the signs began to show. Min-ho began arriving home later and later, justifying himself with meetings that stretched into the night. His cell phone, previously left on the table, now never left his pocket. When Ji-yeon asked a question, she received only short, curt answers, often accompanied by impatient looks. The distance between them, which had previously seemed a result of overwork, now took on the appearance of a secret. Hye-jin, in turn, intensified her presence. Subtly, she became Min-ho's confidant, listening to his frustrations, laughing at his jokes, offering words of comfort that felt like balm to the bruised ego of a man who was always under pressure. She knew when to retreat and when to advance, and it was in this game of manipulation that she created a dangerous connection. Meanwhile, Ji-yeon felt the emptiness growing in her routine. The smile that once brightened dinners now faded. Conversations were reduced to formalities, and the loneliness within her own home became unbearable. Even so, she chose to believe. She chose to believe that it was all just a difficult phase, that her husband would soon return to being the man with whom she had shared her dreams and hopes. But the illusion didn't last long. One night, while setting the dinner table, Ji-yeon realized Min-ho wouldn't be returning anytime soon. At that moment, a message on her phone vibrated on the table. It wasn't from her, but the notification revealed a detail impossible to ignore. A reminder of a private meeting with Hye-jin at a luxurious Gangnam hotel. Ji-yeon's heart sank, but she chose silence, believing she could still salvage what was left of her marriage. However, each time she tried to get closer, Min-ho retreated further. His apologies became harsh, his gestures cold, and his gaze distant. It was as if Ji-yeon had ceased to exist for him, while Hye-jin gradually gained more space in his life. And just when Ji-yeon thought she'd reached the limit of her silent grief, the situation reached a point of no return. A public event, which was supposed to be just another corporate celebration, was about to turn into the stage for the cruelest humiliation. The ballroom of the five-star hotel in Gangnam was packed with Seoul's elite. Businessmen, politicians, and influential members of society gathered to celebrate another achievement of the Daehan Corporation conglomerate. The tables were decorated with lush floral arrangements, crystal glasses reflected the golden lights, and journalists lined up to record every detail of what promised to be a memorable evening. For many, this event symbolized the pinnacle of Kang Min-ho's career, and everyone eagerly awaited the speech of the man who had become a beacon of power and success. Ji-yeon, discreet as ever, arrived accompanying her husband. She wore an elegant, modern hanbok in soft tones, her serene smile still present, though inside she carried a heart shattered by the absences and silences that suffocated her. Many guests greeted her respectfully, calling her Mrs. Kang, as if she still represented the perfect wife who sustained the empire with her impeccable bearing. She responded to everyone politely, ignoring the curious glances that already noted the cold distance between the couple. The atmosphere seemed controlled until, midway through the celebration, Min-ho decided to surprise the audience. Instead of thanking his business partners, he turned his gaze to the crowd and called to the stage a figure many knew only as his devoted secretary, Yoon Hye-jin. With measured steps and a triumphant smile, she approached, being greeted with an intense gaze that none of the guests dared interpret innocently. It was then that the cruelest moment occurred. In front of everyone, Min-ho took Hye-jin's hand, removed the gold ring he still wore on her finger, and without hesitation, placed it on his lover's ring finger. A murmur spread through the room like a ripple after a stone is dropped into water. Journalists recorded the scene with incessant flashes. Business people looked at each other in shock, and Ji-yeon, motionless, felt the world crumble before her eyes. She didn't cry, scream, or make a fuss. She remained standing, her face held high, even as the cameras captured every detail of her restrained expression. Her silence contrasted with the growing hubbub, and this quiet dignity only heightened the intensity of the humiliation. In the eyes of society, the message was clear. Ji-yeon had been publicly replaced, erased from the life of a man who now displayed his new conquest as a trophy. Some guests tried to look away, others remained attentive, as if watching a scene from a real drama. Ji-yeon walked to the exit of the hall with firm steps, each movement accompanied by whispers and whispers. With each click of the cameras, her pain became a spectacle, and yet she didn't allow a single tear to fall in front of those present. Min-ho, next to Hye-jin, continued smiling for the cameras, intoxicated by the feeling of victory, without imagining that that gesture would be remembered not as a symbol of power, but as the beginning of his own downfall. And as Ji-yeon walked through the hall doors, leaving behind the false glow of the lights and the echo of the embarrassed applause, something inside her broke definitively. What had been only suspicion had now become a cruel reality, and this would be the first day of an even more painful fall. Because if the public humiliation already seemed unbearable, what would come next would plunge Ji-yeon into a darkness that few would be able to endure. That night, after leaving the suffocatingly bright salon, Ji-yeon walked alone through the cold streets of Seoul. Her heels clicked against the drizzle-dampened asphalt, each step echoing like the weight of a cruel sentence. There were no more cameras, no more whispers, but the silence surrounding her was even more devastating. Inside her, the images of humiliation replayed like an endless film. Min-ho's gaze shining on Hye-jin, the ring being ripped off, the camera flashes recording her silent defeat. In her home, the walls, which once held memories of simple, happy times, now seemed to suffocate her. The familiar scent of jasmine tea no longer brought comfort. Old travel photos, which showed sincere smiles and intertwined hands, became cruel witnesses to what had been lost. Ji-yeon tried to convince herself that she could resist, that there was still a chance to rebuild something with the man she loved so much. But with each attempt, the emptiness grew. The pain reached its most excruciating peak when, days later, alone in her room, Ji-yeon suffered a miscarriage. With no one to support her, she held her belly with trembling hands, feeling not only the loss of the life she carried, but also the collapse of all the dreams she had silently built. The news never reached Min-ho, who at that very moment was smiling in interviews alongside his lover. Ji-yeon told no one. She buried her pain in secret, crying into tear-soaked sheets. The phone, which rang only with cold messages or social demands, seemed to mock her loneliness. Friends drifted away, relatives whispered in hushed tones, and society, always quick to judge, labeled her the failed wife who lost ground to the younger lover. Yet even when the darkness seemed complete, there was something in her eyes that wouldn't go out. Between the tears and the silence, a subtle, almost imperceptible flame remained, as if the deep pain were planting the seeds of a transformation yet to come. Ji-yeon didn't know when or how, but she sensed that this suffering wouldn't be the end of her story. The days dragged by with cruel slowness. She avoided events, closed curtains, and immersed herself in endless reading just to avoid hearing her own mind repeat the words that hurt her most: rejected, replaced, forgotten. And yet, between the intervals of her pain, a new realization began to emerge, that life would only have meaning if she were able to stand up, not for Min-ho, but for herself. It was at this crossroads between ruin and survival that Ji-yeon made a silent decision. Without telling anyone, without needing witnesses, she began planning her exit from Seoul. Perhaps it was cowardice, perhaps it was courage, but above all, it was the need to get away from the place where every corner, every building, and every face reminded her of her downfall. And when she finally packed her bags and closed the door behind her, a strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't complete relief, but it wasn't despair either. It was as if the cold, early morning wind heralded the beginning of an unexpected journey. Because although it seemed like Ji-yeon was just running away from a shattered life, what she didn't know was that far away, a new version of herself was about to be born, and that this silent rebirth would become the key to a turnaround no one would have dared to imagine. When Ji-yeon left Seoul, the city seemed to swallow behind it all the memories she wanted to forget. The bright streets, the skyscrapers that once represented her triumph alongside Min-ho, and the salons filled with flashbulbs were no longer part of her routine. She took a train to Busan without saying goodbye to anyone, carrying only a few clothes, a few belongings, and the weight of a heart marked by pain. The sea, stretching out before her upon arrival, brought the sense of distance she so desperately needed. The salty breeze, the endless horizon, and the sound of the waves were unlike any luxurious salon. Here, finally, she had room to breathe. In the early days, the loneliness was almost unbearable. Ji-yeon rented a small apartment near the harbor, where the smell of fresh fish and the sounds of fishermen filled the air every morning. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching the city's hustle and bustle without truly participating in it. It was as if she were observing the world from the outside, trying to find a reason to exist amidst the emptiness. She still wept silently, still felt the absence of something she had lost forever. But little by little she realized that this place could offer not only refuge, but also a path to transformation. It was one afternoon, while walking through the artistic district of Gamcheon, known for its colorful streets and painted houses, that something awakened within her. A makeshift studio displayed vibrant paintings that contrasted with the gray of her memories. The owner, a white-haired man, noticed her lost gaze and invited her in. There, surrounded by paints and canvases, Ji-yeon felt for the first time a spark of life rekindled. She didn't need to say much. The silence said it all. Over time, she began to work discreetly in that studio, learning to restore works and later creating small pieces of art. With each brushstroke, each stroke, she seemed to be reconstructing fragments of herself. Her pain didn't disappear, but rather took shape, color, and expression. What had previously been mere mourning transformed into something new, silent strength. Busan's small artistic circle soon noticed her dedication. People began visiting her, admiring the serenity she exuded, Many didn't know her past, only seeing the woman reinventing herself before their very eyes. And for Ji-yeon, this was the liberation she needed. She was no longer Kang Min-ho's rejected wife. Here, she was simply Ji-yeon, an artist in the making. Between days of work and nights of study, she also discovered the importance of friendship. She met other women who, like her, carried life's scars, and together they created an invisible support network. In conversations over hot tea, they shared stories of loss, but also of hope. Ji-yeon found in this circle the courage she hadn't had in Seoul, the courage to move forward without looking back. 2 years passed, and the woman who had quietly left the capital was no longer the same. Her small studio grew into a respected art gallery in the city, even welcoming foreign visitors. Her image once again appeared in local newspapers, but this time not as a victim, but as an example of resilience. The sparkle in her eyes came not from luxury or status, but from the conviction that she had found a purpose beyond her pain. Still, in moments of introspection, Ji-yeon knew her story wasn't over. The past lingered, like a shadow that could appear at any moment. Kang Min-ho's name, which she avoided pronouncing, continued to echo in Seoul's power circles, and every now and then some news reached her ears. News that spoke of growth, but also of instability. And deep down, a part of her understood that life would still bring an inevitable reunion, because while Ji-yeon was being reborn in silence, Min-ho, on his throne of arrogance, began to grapple with cracks that would soon become chasms. While Ji-yeon was rebuilding in Busan, finding strength in brushstrokes and new connections in Seoul, Kang Min-ho's empire was beginning to show cracks. At first, they were just rumors, discreet comments in corporate corridors. But soon the rumors turned into quiet headlines in financial newspapers. Meetings that once ended with applause now dragged on in tense silence. Investors who once trusted blindly began to question figures, and traditional partners of Daehan Corporation began to watch from afar, as if sensing the ship was no longer sailing in safe waters. At the center of this collapse was Ji-yeon, the woman he believed to be a symbol of renewal. Ambitious and manipulative, she had carved out a niche not only in Min-ho's personal life, but also in decisions that should never have been left in his hands. Convinced that her charm was also a sign of strategic intelligence, Min-ho allowed her into crucial meetings. But what Ji-yeon truly knew wasn't about business. It was about power, appearance, and manipulation. Little by little, poor choices began to erode the group's stability. Poorly signed contracts, risky investments in foreign markets, and even fragile political alliances that couldn't withstand the pressure. Min-ho's arrogance, which consistently rejected advice from more experienced directors, only accelerated the group's downfall. He believed his presence alone was enough to keep everything in order, unaware that for the first time he was no longer respected but feared. And fear never sustains an empire for long. The walls of the luxurious office began to feel like a prison. The phone rang with bills, reports showed red numbers, and the employees' looks reflected distrust. Min-ho, who had always prided himself on his impeccable image, began to lose sleepless nights, hiding dark circles behind forced smiles in front of the cameras. At his side, Ji-yeon demanded more and more: luxurious trips, expensive gifts, private parties that drained not only his fortune, but also his credibility. It was during this period that Min-ho realized something he'd never considered. The respect he'd always craved no longer came from the market, nor from his partners, nor even from the lover who now shared his bed. What remained was a loneliness disguised by contracts and glasses of champagne. When he looked at the emptiness of his Gangnam penthouse, he involuntarily remembered Ji-yeon's serenity, the way she'd straighten his tie on hectic mornings, the comforting silence he now missed. But it was too late to go back. The press soon scented blood. Business magazines began publishing articles questioning Daehan Corporation's transparency. Independent blogs insinuated that Ji-yeon, more than a companion, had direct influence on disastrous decisions. Min-ho tried to control the narrative, but he no longer had reliable allies. Directors were stepping down, investors were withdrawing their shares, and each negative headline felt like a direct blow to the pride he had so cultivated. The empire was beginning to crumble, and with it, the mask of security Min-ho had always displayed. The halls, once aglow with the confidence in his name, now echoed with hushed conversations about his inability to lead. He clung desperately to his public image, organizing ever more lavish events to hide his problems, but each party sounded like a cry of despair. And it was in this unstable environment that a bold and completely misguided decision began to be planned. To regain credibility and silence criticism, Min-ho decided to hold the event that would mark his definitive union with Ji-yeon. A grand wedding, planned down to the smallest detail, capable of diverting the attention of the market and reaffirming his social standing. He believed the spectacle would be enough to erase his mistakes, little imagining that this choice would be the stage for the most painful revelation of his life. Because while he believed he could save himself through ostentation, Ji-yeon was silently preparing to reappear before everyone. And the unexpected appearance of that woman, whom he thought he had erased from his own history, would transform what should have been an act of redemption into an unprecedented scandal. The big day arrived, and Seoul woke up shrouded in rumors. CEO Kang Min-ho's wedding to Yoon Hye-jin was not just a private celebration, but a social event awaited by the country's elite. The streets near the luxurious hotel where the ceremony would take place were filled with reporters, onlookers, and television cameras, all eager to capture every detail. It was the spectacle Min-ho had planned, to transform the fragility of his image into a public display of power and stability. The ballroom was even more dazzling than at any previous event. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light. Tables covered in imported flowers adorned the space, and the central aisle, lined with a white carpet, led to the altar as if it were the path to a throne. Important guests, politicians, business people, celebrities, sat in perfectly aligned chairs, awaiting the moment when the couple would emerge. For many, this wedding symbolized Min-ho's victory over the rumors and the consolidation of his new era with his lover. Hye-jin, in a private room, prepared herself with the help of stylists. She proudly wore her chosen wedding dress, a luxurious outfit that seemed tailor-made to showcase her rise. As the makeup artists finalized the touches, she smiled in the mirror, convinced she had won the biggest battle of her life, taking Ji-yeon's place. But fate had a twist in store. Among the guests, the cameras captured an unexpected presence that quickly drew glances and whispers. Ji-yeon entered the room accompanied by an influential Japanese investor, whose recent partnership with her gallery had drawn attention in art and business circles. Unlike the faded and wounded woman many remembered, she appeared radiant, elegant, wearing a sophisticated dress that highlighted not only her beauty, but also the confidence of someone reborn from her own ashes. The murmur spread like wildfire. It's her, the ex-wife. How dare she show up here? Look at her. She looks like a different person. The guests, previously distracted by small talk, were now mesmerized by the serene figure walking among them. Ji-yeon wasn't seeking applause, wasn't displaying vanity. Her presence was enough to transform the atmosphere. Min-ho, upon seeing her, felt a shock that he tried to hide with a frozen smile. For an instant the hall disappeared, and all he saw was the woman who had once sustained his dreams. A tightness gripped his chest, but he pulled himself together, remembering that his new bride was by his side. Ji-yeon, however, upon learning of Ji-yeon's arrival, felt her blood run cold. The dress she wore, the one she believed to be her consecration, hid a detail that no one there had yet noticed, except Ji-yeon herself. Ji-yeon sat silently, maintaining her impeccable posture. There was no anger in her gaze, only a serenity that was even more disturbing. Her every gesture seemed carefully calculated to convey that she was there not as a victim, but as someone who no longer belonged to the past. The mood in the ballroom changed completely. The guests no longer waited just for the ceremony, but for the next reaction. It was as if everyone sensed something was about to happen, something beyond Minho and Ji-yeon's control. And when the doors opened for the bride's triumphant entrance, no one imagined that the dress, the ultimate symbol of that moment, would be the trigger for a scandal capable of destroying everything Minho was trying to preserve. The ballroom doors opened slowly, and all eyes turned to the illuminated hallway. Ji-yeon emerged with measured steps, holding the bouquet of white flowers and flaunting the dress that was supposed to be the culmination of her victory. The guests gasped, some applauded discreetly, and the cameras captured every detail of her triumphant entrance. Minho, standing at the altar, lifted his chin proudly, as if believing that, in the sight of this, everyone would forget their mistakes. But as Ji-yeon walked across the white carpet, a sense of unease filled the room. Some guests frowned, others stared at each other in silence. There was something strange about the dress, the delicate lace, the unique cut, the intricate embroidery. It all seemed all too familiar to anyone who had frequented Seoul's luxurious salons. The murmur began low, almost imperceptible, but within seconds it grew into a collective whisper that echoed like suppressed thunder. It was at that moment that Ji-yeon rose from her chair. With firm steps, she crossed the hall, her presence commanding immediate respect. The noise ceased, and everyone waited in silence for what was to come. Before the altar, her eyes fixed on Ji-yeon, who felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Then, in a clear and calm voice, Ji-yeon said, "That dress wasn't made for you." A shock ran through the room. Ji-yeon tried to smile, but her expression faltered. Ji-yeon continued, each word a direct blow. "This suit was custom designed for me, for my first wedding with Kang Min-ho. Even the seams bear my name." The silence was broken by a burst of whispers, cameras flashing non-stop. The guests' eyes widened, some clapping their hands over their mouths in shock. Min-ho, paralyzed, couldn't react. The humiliation he had inflicted years ago was now multiplied in front of everyone. Ji-yeon, pale, tried to justify herself, but no words seemed enough. The dress, which should have been her consecration, had become living proof of her boldness and her attempt to occupy a place that never belonged to her. Ji-yeon, however, didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. Her calm was even more devastating than any scream. The repercussions were immediate. Smartphones broadcast the scene in real time, and within minutes, social media exploded with the revelation. Photos, videos, and comments went viral, transforming the wedding into a national scandal. And in that hall, where luxury tried to cover the truth, it was clear to everyone that the downfall of Kang Min-ho and Ji-yeon had only just begun. Because if the revelation of the dress already seemed enough to destroy reputations, no one imagined that Ji-yeon still had the final blow in store, as elegant as it was devastating. The ballroom, which moments before had been brimming with luxury and anticipation, was now plunged into a heavy silence, interrupted only by the incessant flashes of cameras and the nervous whispers of the guests. The dress, which should have symbolized triumph, had become irrefutable evidence of Ji-yeon's emotional fraud and Kang Min-ho's blind arrogance. Ji-yeon stood motionless, haughty, like a silent judge whose presence alone proclaimed the truth. Within minutes, social media was abuzz. Live streams captured the exact moment Ji-yeon exposed the dress, while hashtags with her name and that of Minho's company soared to the top of the trending topics. What had previously seemed like an extravagant wedding turned into a public spectacle of humiliation. Investors present discreetly rose to their feet, leaving the room, and those watching online sent messages demanding explanations. The image of the impeccable CEO crumbled under the tide of evidence. Min-ho, once confident, now displayed an unhealthy pallor. Ji-yeon trembled, trying to stay upright. Ji-yeon didn't need to raise her voice or linger. A firm look, a restrained gesture, and her message was clear. There was no need for loud revenge, because the truth spoke for itself. With a discreet wave, she withdrew from the altar, leaving behind the devastating image of the exposed couple, her every step silently crushing the arrogance Min-ho had cultivated for years. Outside, journalists waited for statements. Ji-yeon entered the car calmly, without words, but their absence spoke louder than any fiery speech could. The public interpreted her attitude as strength and class, cementing her image as a woman who, even when wronged, never lost her elegance. The consequences were immediate. Daehan Corporation's shares plummeted, and media outlets that had previously praised Min-ho now questioned his leadership abilities. Videos comparing Ji-yeon and Ji-yeon went viral, highlighting the contrast between the wife who had sustained the empire and the mistress who helped it destroy it. Ji-yeon's revenge didn't require direct confrontation. Her impeccable poise and the timely revelation of the truth were enough to bring Min-ho to his knees. The scandal wouldn't end that day. Contracts were cancelled, directors resigned, and Ji-yeon began revealing her true colors to the press. Ji-yeon quietly resumed her life, while Min-ho, exposed to the world, confronted for the first time the weight of his own pride and the lonely reflection of his downfall. Kang Min-ho's old office, located on the top floor of Daehan Corporation, no longer held the luster that had once reflected his power. The blinds remained closed, blocking the city light from invading the space that now felt like a mausoleum of memories. The stacks of documents scattered across the desk were no longer expansion plans, but termination notices, loss reports, and resignation letters from executives who had once fawned over him. The phone, which used to ring with invitations to dinners and conferences, now remained deathly silent. Min-ho spent his nights sitting in the same leather armchair, staring at the television screen that tirelessly broadcast Ji-yeon being honored in Busan. Her art gallery had become an international reference, attracting renowned investors and critics, while he, once hailed as a corporate genius, became nothing more than a shadow commented on in scandal sheets. Every time he saw her serene smile, as she accepted an award or gave a speech about resilience, something inside him shattered even more. Regret was an invisible prison. He remembered the nights Ji-yeon would wait for him with hot tea, the mornings she would straighten his tie, the times she would hold his hands with unwavering trust. All these memories came back to him now like sharp knives, revealing how much he had lost by believing her love would be eternal, unconditional, immune to his betrayals. Ji-yeon, once his triumphant lover, was no longer by his side. She had abandoned him as soon as she realized his ruin was irreversible. The luxurious Gangnam apartment was empty, and even the most loyal staff had distanced themselves, fearing they would sink alongside the man who had once seemed invincible. All that remained was the echo of his own choices, reflected in the silence of every room. Min-ho, for the first time, looked in the mirror without adornments or rehearsed smiles. His face, marked by dark circles and premature wrinkles revealed not only the weight of the years, but also the burden of his decisions. He silently wondered if fate would have been different if he had valued the woman who had been by his side from the beginning, but he knew that answer would never come. Time does not heal wounds of regret. And as he watched Ji-yeon shine on the screen, he realized there was no going back. She wasn't just the woman he'd lost. She was a living reminder that all the power in the world can't erase. The consequences of cruelty. The silence of the office seemed to whisper a sentence he dared not repeat aloud. True victory belongs not to those who humiliate, but to those who survive and reinvent themselves. And it was in this emptiness, surrounded by memories and ghosts, that Min-ho sensed that he would see Ji-yeon for the last time. But not as someone who could win her back, but as a witness to the final message she would leave to the world. In Busan, a gentle sea breeze blew across the terrace where Ji-yeon was attending a benefit organized by her gallery. Underprivileged children ran among the exhibits, laughing, while volunteers distributed books and food. The atmosphere was brimming with humanity, a far cry from the artificial glitz of Seoul's lavish parties. There, she felt at peace, as if every step she took had been rewarded by that moment. With the microphone in hand, Ji-yeon didn't deliver a speech about art or business. She spoke about pain, about how every scar can become a path to a new beginning. Her eyes reflected serenity as she affirmed that when all seemed lost, she discovered within herself a strength she never imagined existed. "No dress can hide the truth," she said firmly, "because time always sows justice." The audience gave a standing ovation, moved, recognizing not only the businesswoman, but the woman who rose from her own ashes. Meanwhile, in a dark Seoul apartment, Min-ho watched the broadcast on television. His teary eyes stared at the image of Ji-yeon smiling, surrounded by applause. He heard not just words, but a sentence that sealed his fate. He knew he would never be part of that story again, that his arrogance had destroyed everything he held most precious. The screen reflected not only her triumph, but the cruel reminder of his downfall. On the sunlit terrace, Ji-yeon smiled softly as she gazed at the horizon. There was no revenge in her expression, only liberation. The sea opening before her was a metaphor for a life, expanding in new directions, unfettered by the chains of the past. Her journey didn't end there. It was merely the beginning of a greater journey, built on dignity, courage, and truth. And so, Ji-yeon's story ended, not as that of a woman broken by contempt, but as that of someone who transformed pain into strength and who taught by her own example that the justice of time always arrives, sometimes slowly, but relentlessly. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and stay tuned for our next episodes. The next story will move you even more, and it may be even more surprising than this one.